Good evening, everyone. I thought I would actually do a summary video that covers chapter 1 through 4. So this is going to be quick hitters, things that we talked about. They were either in the text, in the class notes, in the videos that I recorded. But at the end of the day, things that we should remember, things that you should include in your toolbox as we're building that toolbox out, and things that should help you either in follow-on classes or as you get out into the real world and get into that first job, or if you're already in a job, should help you be a more productive asset for that particular company. Let's start off and just say, I want everybody to remember that economics is a social science. It's concerned with consumer behavior when making choices among alternatives. And remember, that's that the key, I guess the key takeaway is talking about consumer choices among alternatives. And then we've talked about opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the value of the option sacrificed, or the value of the next best alternative when making choices or trade-offs between scarce resources. A scarce resource is a resource that can only be used for one alternative at a time. Almost all goods are scarce resources. And again, remember, we talked about scarce goods, we talked about free goods, which there are very few of those. And then we talked about public goods, which are really they don't fall into the they do somewhat fall into the non-excludable category, but they are usually provided as a result of taxation. So things like streets, sidewalks, street lights, national parks, lakes, parks in your local community, those are considered public goods, because remember, scarce goods are excludable, only one alternative at a time. Also, scarce goods, I've heard people call them private goods. And as I said, they're excludable, only use them one at a time. They're rival goods. They can only be used uniquely and have many alternative uses and require the sacrifice of an alternative use. So that's how scarce goods tie back to opportunity costs. Scarcity requires answering the following fundamental questions of economics. And we've talked about them kind of ad nauseum, but it's, what are we going to produce? How are we going to produce? For whom are we going to produce? And what is our preservation for the future? And a lot of individuals don't actually consider the preservation for the future, because and as we talked about in one of the classes, retained earnings in the stock market. So corporations, if they make a profit, they can either keep some of that profit for retained earnings, or they can pass it on to the shareholders in dividends. That retained earnings are what they are keeping in their back pocket for preservation for future use. And we talked about, and again, ad nauseum, and I feel like, and some of you may think I'm beating a dead horse on a lot of these things, but I want to make sure that you understand the concepts, because they are going to be vital in you being successful as you go out into the real world. The things that differentiate economics from other social sciences is they study choice, because there's a lot of social sciences that study choice. Social workers, MFCCs, anthropologists, all social sciences that study choice and study the behavior of consumers in personal choice. But economics tries to differentiate themselves because they focus on opportunity cost. They make the assumption that consumers are optimizers, not only consumers, but providers or sellers, or so buyers and sellers, they're both optimizers. Buyers or consumers, however you want to categorize them, are trying to optimize utility, benefits, satisfaction from consuming that good or service. And then sellers or producers are trying to optimize. They are, it's their self-interest to be profit maximizers. So they're trying to optimize. And also in economic framework, decisions are made at the margin. We talked about walking into McDonald's and you can buy Big Mac, French fries, Coke. You can buy it all independently or a la carte, and it may be, I don't know, $10. But they give you a Happy Meal option it's only like $8.25. And so you're looking at that $10 bill and you're thinking, if I optimize and I buy that, or I buy it at the margin, and I end up buying that Happy Meal for $8.25, I've got $1.75 to do something else with. So that's one of, those are the three things that differentiate economics from your other social sciences. Also, don't ever forget that economists, and some people look at us as economists as being a little weird and maybe a little off center and may not really live in the real world, but economists or in the economic framework, we invoke that ceteris paribus, and that's basically saying all of the things equal, all of the things are unchanged, and that's what we use when we developed our models, because it is an extremely complex world, and we have a difficulty in kind of managing because we cannot develop these models in a controlled environment. It's not like we're a biologist or a botanist or a chemist or a physicist where we have some opportunity to kind of have these things in a controlled environment. But unfortunately, as an economist, it doesn't really work that way. And we also talked about economic systems. They determine how scarce resources are to be owned and how production decisions are made utilizing our scarce resources. And if you think back to the economic systems, you had the market capitalist and had the command socialist. So the market capitalist, a lot of the resources are owned by individuals, or they're owned by a corporation, and those individuals, or the CEO or the CFO or the COO of that corporation, are making decisions on how those scarce resources not only are owned, but how they're used in the production process. You flip it over to the command socialist, a lot of that is owned by the state. The state's making determinations on how it should be utilized. Used to be, your big command socialists, you thought of North Korea, you thought of China, you thought of Russia. We still think of North Korea as a command socialist. Russia and to some extent China have kind of moved out of that command socialist environment. They're a long way from being a market capitalist, but they're kind of edging in that direction. Capital goods, capital stock, if you think about the factors of production, these are a little, I don't want to say unique, but to be a capital good or a capital stock, it must have been produced, and it can be used to produce other goods and services. So when I say it must have been produced, it's like it's not crude oil would be considered a natural resource, but gasoline that's produced from crude oil that is used in farm equipment, in your tractor, or it's used in bulldozers to build a apartment building. That's what they're talking about capital goods. It has to have been produced, and it has to be used to produce other goods and services. One of the other factors of kind of production, you talk about labor, and that's where you talk about the quality of labor versus the quantity of labor. If you talk about quantity, you can just increase the unskilled natural resource of those individuals with just natural ability, or you can increase the skills, and that's productivity enhancing, and that's where we talk about human capital. So you've got the labor market, and you've got the two kind of chunks of the labor market. You've got the unskilled and you've got the skilled. And the way to get that unskilled moved over to the skilled is to start improving their human capital through education, through training, through other opportunities, anything that can be utilized to move that unskilled into the skilled environment is going to be beneficial in the production process. And then we talked about technology as a factor of production. Technology and entrepreneur are kind of hand in hand. Technology is knowledge. Remember, it is knowledge and efficiency of the production process. So some people think about technology and they think about the Apple computer you have or the iPhone you have, but when you're talking about factors of production, software and ingenuity and those kind of things feed into the technology. But a lot of times they're talking about in the factors of production, they're talking about technology being used to improve the production process. And then entrepreneurs, they're just basically individuals, seeking to make more profit, and they find new ways to organize the factors of production, new ways to improve the production process. I have in the past utilized and actually sent individuals to school to get their Lean Six Sigma certification, because once they get that black belt in Lean Six Sigma, they look at the production process within at least the health plan environment. They look at it in a whole different mindset. We talked about the production possibility curves, and that basically gives you different combinations of potential goods and services that can be produced, and it focuses on opportunity, cost, and scarcity. And again, it talks about potential goods and services, combinations, food and clothing, as an example they may have used in a textbook, skis and snowboards, two different goods looking at opportunity, cost, and scarcity. And to really be on that in that production possibility curve, it's bold and it kind of concave into the origin of the XY axis. For those to be on that production possibility curve and to be a competitive advantage on that curve, resources must be fully employed, they must be used efficiently, and determining that production possibility curve, always remember the factors of production are fixed. If the factors of production aren't fixed, that's usually a sign of economic growth. So improvement in technology, improvement in the labor force, and it will actually take and help move that production possibility curve away from the origin. And in moving it away from the origin, that's an indicator of economic growth. If you are actually if you look at the base production possibility curve, or PPC, if you're inside that, that means you're not using resources, they're not fully employed, or you're not very efficient. And if you're outside of that production possibility curve, as long as your factors of production are fixed, that's an unattainable position. So to attain that position, you have to have economic growth to help push that curve outward. And it talks about operations, and it talks about inefficient production, or if resources are not utilized at the fullest employment, you will move an economy inside their production possibility curve. And that's the thing that the authors are trying to drive home. If you're not, resources, factors of production fully employed, if they're not efficiently utilized, it's going to move that point of production inside that production possibility curve. Comparative advantage implies that one economy can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another economy. And that's where we start talking about comparative advantage. The authors also talked about international trade and its impact on comparative advantage. And then somewhere along in, I guess it was in chapter 2, they start talking about specialization. Specialization has actually increased the wealth and the standard of living in a lot of countries. The United States, some underdeveloped countries. And it's that specialization, the ability to specialize in a particular production process of a good and service. It helps not only international trade, but it helps to push that wealth and standard of living forward. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations talked about division of labor, and that's, I guess, the initial thought process of how companies or how countries especially specialize. Differences in the cost of production drive comparative advantage. And then when we're talking about a comparative advantage, also always remember the assumptions of economic thought. Opportunity cost, optimization, decisions at the margin. And specialization is one of the concepts or one of the, I guess, the buzzwords that drives international trade. You have some countries that are really specialized, have a comparative advantage of doing one thing. You have another country that maybe not good at doing, process A, but they're really good at process B. And then it's kind of a negotiation process. Each country has their comparative advantage in that production process, process A, process B, and then they start, at least initially, thinking about some international trade, because it makes not only both countries better off, but it makes the population and those individuals living in those countries better off. Chapter 3 was where we started getting into demand, supply, some of your tools that are going in your toolbox that are going to be extremely beneficial going forward. Demand is a relationship between the price of a good and the quantity people are willing and able to purchase. And remember, ceteris paribus, all other things equal. And I can't emphasize enough that demand, there are two components to it. You have to be interested in the good or service. You have to be able to seek that good or service, and you have to be willing and able to pay for it. And I think one of the examples I gave was sushi. Sushi can be free, and I'm never going to buy sushi. I don't like sushi. So there's never going to be a demand from me for sushi, because while I'm willing and able to pay for it, I have no desire to seek out sushi. And that is the driver in demand: willingness to seek it out, desire to seek it out, and the willingness and affordability to pay for it. Law of demand, all other things equal, and for the majority of the goods and services we have, price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. A change in demand means that demand curve, so it's downward sloping, that demand curve, if there's a change in demand, some of the demand shifters that we talked about in class are causing that curve either to move to the right or move to the left. Move to the right, it increases demand. Move down to the left, it decreases demand. A change in the quantity demanded is a movement along that demand curve. So the demand curve is either shifting out or left. Once that demand curve becomes stable, then quantity demanded, it's prices on your vertical, quantities on the horizontal, and its movements along that demand curve, what you're willing to pay and the quantities of those individual items that you're interested in at that given price. Also, when we're talking about demand, they throw out substitutes and complements. Substitutes, most people think coffee and tea, Coke and Pepsi, anything that is an alternative substitute. And when you're talking about substitutes, as the price in one goes up, the demand in the other one goes down. So substitutes, it make sure I said that right. If the price in one goes up, then the demand in the other goes up, and the price of one goes down, then the demand in the other one goes down. So you're talking about coffee, and we're talking about coffee and tea. So if the price of coffee goes up, the demand for tea is going to go up. They move in the same direction on substitutes. If the price of coffee goes down, all of the things unchanged, then the demand for tea is going to go down. If you're talking about complements, they move in the opposite direction. I think that the example they gave in the textbook, tennis rackets and tennis balls, and that actually makes sense. As the price of tennis rackets goes up, then the demand of tennis balls goes down. Or if the price of tennis rackets falls, then the demand for tennis balls will also move in that opposite direction. So it actually just has to stop and think about that. But substitutes are, basically alternatives. Complements are things that go together. Maybe that's the best way to look at it. And if you look at the price and demand curve, so the demand curve sloping downward, the supply curve sloping upward, all other things equal, that's the way that prices and quantities are going to react. If you're talking about it, then we talked for a few minutes ago about things that would shift that demand curve either right or left. Prices, this is a big prices that like the 800-pound gorilla that shifts that demand curve. Also, you have consumer preferences and information, prices of related goods, income. Income is a huge driver on that shift in that demand curve, and especially in a state like Tennessee where you have no state income tax, you're going to have more disposable income, all of the things equal. Demographics, younger population, older population, they're going to shift that demand curve, up or down, right or left, depending on what good or service it is. And consumer expectations. Consumers, let's say the price of automobiles. They think that, if they wait, that the price of a new car for some reason is going to come down. So rather than buying a car now, they're going to wait for the new models to come out. Or if they think that, if you think that the price of the next iPhone that's going to come out is going to be, through the roof, then, you may decide, well, my expectation is I'm just going to keep my old iPhone for a year or two and see if I can't get by with it. We talked about normal and inferior goods. So a normal good is one where if your income goes up, the demand goes up. If your income goes down, the demand goes down. Again, they move in the same direction. Inferior good, if your income goes up, demand for the good goes down. If your income goes down, demand for the good goes up. Inferior goods, SpaghettiOs, mac and cheese, cheap eats. I was going to say happy hour, but even if you've got plenty of income, you like to take advantage of happy hour. Normal good, Mercedes, the next greatest iPhone that's coming out, going out and eating steak as opposed to going to McDonald's for dinner. All of those are kind of fall in that normal good category. And then we talked about change in supply. It means the supply curve, so it's upward sloping. It's going to shift right if there's an increase in supply. It's going to shift left if there's a decrease in supply. And remember, just like quantity demanded, change in the quantity supplied means you're moving along that supply curve. Different prices, different quantities, just moving along that supply curve once it's established. Supply shifters, cost of inputs, technology. We've talked about technology. So cost of inputs, higher the cost of inputs, less profit. So could be a decrease in supply. Improvement in technology should lower the cost of producing goods and services. So in theory, it could end up with higher profits. Returns from alternative activities. That's where we're getting into opportunity cost on the supply side or the producer side of the curve. Seller expectations. Sellers also always trying to figure out what are going to be the buyer's expectations moving forward. You've got natural events, hurricanes, tornadoes, bad winter this year in the state of Georgia. Peach crop's going to be in short supply this year. Same thing you'll see happen in Florida, the cold snap, bad winter, called colder weather in Florida than normal. And you have issues with citrus growers. You have issues with citrus supply. Number of sellers, more sellers in the market, the more productive or production is going to be provided, and it's going to increase that supply. It's going to move that thing to the right. If you don't remember anything about chapter 3, and I can't remember which page in the book it's on, but in the book, back toward the end of the chapter, the authors provide this little 2x2, and it's got supply across the top, it's got demand down the side. And if you could remember that little 2x2 that they provide for you, that's going to be extremely beneficial for you going forward. Some students like to take the supply and demand curve and they like to shut their eyes and, in their mind's eye, they like to move those, curves up and down. Others like to draw it out on a piece of paper and slide them back and forth to figure out what's going on. But if you've got supply and demand, got demand sloping down, supply sloping up. If they're both moving to the left, then you automatically know that quantity is going to decrease. The unknown factor is what's going to happen to the price. And it's going to be driven by which one of those curves moves the most. Same thing's going to happen to you if they both move to the right. So supply increases, demand increases, you know that the quantity is going to increase, but you don't know what's going to happen to the price. You don't know how much the price is going to move if it moves, because again, it depends on the magnitude of the shifts to the right for the supply curve, or to the right for the demand curve. So that's what's going to drive that price. It's when they start moving in different directions. So if your demand shifts downward or it moves out to the right, and if the supply moves to the left, so there's fewer goods and services, the price is going to go up, but we don't know what's going to happen with the quantity until we kind of play around with the graphs. Again, it's which one moves the most. The magnitude is going to drive that. If demand moves to the left and supply moves to the right, we know the price is going to decrease. But again, we don't know what's going to happen to the quantity because we've got to play with those curves to figure that out. And then we start talking in chapter 4, the author started talking about kind of the chapter's called the application of supply and demand. And we talk about the demand curve for stocks. At lower prices, more buyers calculate that the expected value of the firm's future earnings justify the stock's price, and then at that point they want to go out and purchase some stock. Supply curve for stocks at a higher prices, most sellers believe that the expected value of the firm's future earnings don't justify the stock prices, and they decide, hey, I'm going to sell mine. And that's what happens when it clears the market. And we've talked about that on multiple occasions, when the number of sellers are offering shares of stock for sale and the number of buyers are buying those shares. So quantity offered equals to quantity purchased. That's at equilibrium price. And the thing about the stock market is information is instantaneous in that stock market. So you're constantly bombarded with new information. And as you purchase stock or you sell stock, that information is automatically relayed to all investors. So they know that the stock is going to be moving up or down, and the stock market is constantly adjusting to that equilibrium price. Also in chapter 4, They talked about things that the government intervention, and I'm maybe somewhat of a pessimist, but I'm not sure I've ever seen a government intervention that worked as efficiently as the policymakers thought it would operate. So a little pessimist on government intervention. They talked about price ceiling. Typically, you think about, and they talked about price floors. So the price ceiling must be set below the equilibrium price. So that's where they were talking about the rent-controlled apartments. And we talked about the black market that occurs with rent-controlled apartments. Price floor is the one that typically you think about with agriculture, but also a price floor is nothing more than minimum wage is set. Minimum wage is set, typically above the market equilibrium price, and that's the way it has to be set in order for it to be effective. So the price floor must be set above the equilibrium price. The price ceiling must be set below the equilibrium price. Legislatures, the legislation for farmers, they were trying to guarantee a minimum price. They were trying to impose limits on production. But what they were trying to do was they were trying to mitigate the fluctuations in incomes because, as we talked about, natural events, weather, crop disease, infestation by insects, all of it impacts the production capabilities of a farmer. And then we talked about, we've already talked about this once, but normal goods, as income goes up, demand goes up. If income goes down, demand goes down. And on an inferior good, if income goes up, demand goes down. And income goes down, demand goes up. So normal goods, they move in the same direction. Inferior goods, they move in the opposite direction. And then we're going to hit on price floors again and subsidies. Generally, a price floor, especially in agriculture, ends up with higher commodity prices at the grocery store. And it's a tax burden and it's an inefficient approach. If you think about the minimum wage, it's going to increase the amount that individuals are paying for those goods and services. It's going to also be a tax burden on them, and it's going to be an inefficient approach. Again, it's a government program that has been inefficient, and while policymakers and especially those working in public policy and welfare economics thought that might be the thing to do, it hadn't always worked out the best. Also, the same thing with price ceilings. You end up with setting as they talk about rent control, you set a rent that should be provide affordable housing to those lower income individuals, but it doesn't work that way. And it just ends up being a tax burden. It's inefficient, and it's inefficient in the rent market. So the bottom line, at least from my perspective, is when you're talking about government intervention, you end up with inefficient alternatives, inefficient policies, and more importantly, you end up with generating black markets. You've got, as we talked about, entrepreneurs. They're constantly thinking of ways to push that efficient frontier forward and to make a profit. And entrepreneurs are going to figure, there's a lot of smart people in the United States, and especially entrepreneurs, they're going to figure out how to work around and game the system. They're going to figure out how to make the black market work and make them profitable. And rather than helping those populations or some populations that either the price floor, the price ceiling was put into effect to help, it's just going to line the pockets of the entrepreneurs. Oh, one other thing we need to talk about, the price floor and the price ceiling. If you're talking about a price floor, that's the minimum legal price that you can sell a good or service for. And if you're talking about a price ceiling, it's the maximum legal price. So that's where it ties back into the black market. It's against the law to sell goods or services below the price floor. And it's against the law to, it's talked about rent control, to rent out apartments that are above the ceiling price. It happens all the time. It's a black market opportunity, and it's most people get by with it and don't get caught. Then they talked about an excise tax. It's an excise, it's a tax on a good or service that actually drives a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive. And they have the little formula in the textbook that says price, they call it P subscript B equals P subscript S plus tax. So basically it's saying the price that the buyers pay equals the price the sellers receive plus the tax. So, and excise tax, they were talking about gasoline, diesel fuel. They threw out the term pay at the pump. And it's one of those things that most people may not even understand there's an excise tax being implemented. There's an excise tax on your cell phone plan. How many people knew that? Or how many people even know that? And then they did throw out the sin tax in some of the documents. And sin tax is, again, where the government thinks that using taxation that they know better than anybody else what's good for you. So sin tax, you typically think of that as alcohol, tobacco products, gambling. I think they said strip shows in the text, but a lot of those activities, or a lot of those goods and services that the government thinks that you would be better off not participating in. And the way they try to discourage that is through an excise tax, which they call the sin tax. Some states may be shifting the gasoline excise tax into kind of a sin tax because they're trying to encourage the purchase and utilization of electric vehicles. So we don't know what the future is going to look like, but excise tax, it's a really simple tax. It's tax that's charged on a unit of a good or service. The seller usually pays that tax, and the seller will, for the most part, try to pass on some of that tax to the buyer. May not pass it all on to the buyer, but they'll try to pass some of it on to the buyer. And then lastly, one thing that we just need to think about is, why does the government, and when I say government, I'm talking about federal, state, city, county, local, why does the government pass on taxes? The most frequent exclamation is just revenue for operations. Goes back to public goods, pay for welfare programs, roads, sidewalks, public schools, parks, recreation, anything that's a public good. Public good's not free. You have to pay for it some way, and it's usually paid for through a type of tax. And they also will try to impose a tax if they think it's going to correct a market failure or market inefficiency. And I think the example they gave in the book is, polluters, entities that are producing goods and services that are polluting the air and the water, and they're talking about taxes there. And then they talk about paternalism, and we've already discussed it, but that's your sin tax. You're doing something that the government thinks you shouldn't do, and the government thinks you'd be better off not doing it, and that the government, let's just pick on Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam and the federal government thinks that they know more about what you should be doing than you do, and as far as maximizing your utility and your satisfaction, your benefit of consuming a good, and they implement the excise tax, and it's called a sin tax. And then the one that a lot of people, you don't hear it mentioned too often, it's a rent-seeking tax, and it's basically an individual that goes to their legislature and trying to improve their comparative advantage or their competitive situation or position in the market. They will use the senators or the representatives' influence to help implement a tax to make them more competitive. And the one that comes to mind quickly for me is an import tax on French wine. So wine producers in Napa Valley went to, I don't know whether they went to Newsom, but they went to one of the legislatures and started asking them to put an import tax on, French wine or Italian wine or German wine to make them more, competitive in the marketplace, to generate more profit for the wines that are produced in California, especially in Napa Valley. That's kind of the wrap up on chapters 1 through 4. It's, kind of quick and dirty, hard hitting, quick points, but that's kind of the way that I've tried to tie chapters 1 through 4 together. It's the way the authors try to tie it together also. So that's our review and summary. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll kind of put together a similar summary for chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 as we go through those. So hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will talk soon. Thank you.